I'm Adam Kochanowicz here for the Vegan News in Times Square, New York City, and this is my interview with Gary Francione. Welcome to the Vegan News, the show where veganism is normal. I'm Adam Kochanowicz, and I'm here with Professor Gary Francione of the Rutgers School of Law in Newark. Welcome to the show, Gary.
And welcome to Newark. This is your first time in Newark.
So tell me a little bit about moral schizophrenia. This is something you mentioned in your book.
Yes.
And I want you to tell us, what is moral schizophrenia in relation to our relations with other animals? And how does this tie into the hype around Michael Vick being reinstalled into the Philadelphia Eagles?
Well, the moral schizophrenia is the notion that we think in a very confused way about animals. On one hand, many of us have non-human companions that we live with that we regard as members of the family. On the other hand, we stick forks into animals that are morally and logically not distinguishable from the animals that we regard as members of our family. And we all would agree with the proposition that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals, yet most of us eat animals, and the best justification we have for killing 56 billion animals a year worldwide, not including fish and other aquatic animals, is that they taste good. So on one hand, we say we take animals seriously. On the other hand, we treat them as things. And on one hand, we love them. On the other hand, we eat them.
So it refers to this
contradiction. It refers to this inherent tension and this confusion. That on one hand, we recognize the moral personhood of non-human animals. On the other hand, we don't recognize it at all, and we treat them as things. You know, there are persons, there are things. On one hand, we recognize their moral personhood, their non-human moral personhood. On the other hand, we treat them as things. And so now, how this feeds into Michael Vick, Adam, is that Michael Vick, for those three people out there who have never heard of Michael Vick, was a football player, is a football player, who was arrested and pled guilty to charges of being involved in a dogfighting ring. And people were very outraged by this, and they've been outraged for several years about what he did. And now that he's joined the Philadelphia Eagles, people were upset that the Eagles took him, and they're upset about the question is, should we go and watch Michael Vick play and things like that?
And these were like animal protection agencies.
Yes, these were, yeah, exactly. I mean, these are a lot. Exactly. I mean, when the Michael Vick thing first happened in, I guess it was '97, there was an outcry from the public generally about it. And people said, this is really horrible what he did with dogfighting. And I wrote an essay then that was published in the Philadelphia Daily News. It was called "We're All Michael Vick," and in that essay, I basically said, look, what Michael Vick likes sitting around watching dogs fight around a pit. The rest of us like to sit around a barbecue pit roasting their corpses. I mean, what difference does it make? He does what he does because he enjoys it. Those of us who eat animal products are doing it because we enjoy it. What difference does it make? And I have to tell you, that essay, it was interesting because I wrote the essay and I sent it to the newspaper, and they took it within a matter of 15 minutes. I mean, I literally got an almost immediate call back. And they said, could we take this? And I said, yeah, you can have it on the condition that you don't change anything. Because it was a long essay. It was a considerably long essay. So they published the whole thing. Yeah. And I got probably in the first couple of weeks, I must have gotten like 1,200, I got well over 1,000 email messages. And they were very interestingly, not evenly, but almost evenly divided. There were slightly more that were very favorable, saying, I never thought about it this way. This is an interesting way of thinking about it. Thanks for bringing this to my, thing. And then I got the other half of the people wanted to kill me, and they were very upset about the fact that I was comparing them to somebody who engaged in dogfighting. That I was comparing them, just because they're meat eaters, with somebody who fights dogs. I suspect also there was a certain number of those people who were upset because they didn't like being compared to a person of color, because this is still America in 2009, which is a deeply racist place. And so I think there was probably some of that. But that's the notion of moral schizophrenia. I mean, this is why I think the animal issue is so very interesting, Adam. That although when I'm talking with people about veganism, one might say, well, but that's just that's a place that's so far away from where most people are right now. That isn't that ridiculous or idealistic to think that you're going to move them to that direction? And the answer is, most people already accept the basic principles which should lead them on their own to veganism. I'm just helping them see the implications of what most people already believe. Most people that I meet will agree with the proposition it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals. Once you say you agree with that, You give me 15 minutes, I'll get you to veganism.
Right. Now, some people would say, well, that's just going to scare people away, or what we should do is we should actually do vegetarian education because that's easier. Now, I'd like to
No,
hear
actually,
your
I think it's
comments
more
on that.
difficult now. I think that's more difficult now.
So you think it's more difficult?
Oh,
than
absolutely. Yeah,
vegetarian
yeah.
education?
Because anybody who thinks about it for a second is going to say, well, what's the difference between flesh and dairy? I mean,
Right, right.
Anybody who really knows the facts. Let me give you an analogous situation. I used to be invited. I used to do a lot of anti-hunting rallies and these demonstrations against hunts, particular hunts. And I remember once being, as one of the last ones I did, I remember being at this place, and I was interviewed by some local media, and the woman who interviewed me said, "Well, you really do have why don't you just be honest about your secret agenda, or your undisclosed agenda, or whatever, your hidden agenda?" And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "The fact that you don't think people should be eating meat at all." And she said, "You're not just opposing this hunt." She said, "You think people should not be eating meat at all."
Mhm.
And I said, I said, "Yes, that's absolutely right." Actually, I said I would take that further and say I don't think people should be eating animal products at all. I said, "Well, what would ever make you think that that was something that I ever tried to hide at any point in my life?"
Right, right.
And she said, "Well, is that your position?" I said, "Absolutely." I said, "I'm opposed to this hunt." I said, "But I'm opposed to people eating all animal products." And then shortly after that, the people who had organized the rally, the animal people who had organized the rally, said, "Why did you say that on television? Why didn't you just keep your comments to the hunt?"
They didn't like that you said that.
No, they didn't like that. They were actually, Adam, they were very upset that I said that. And I said, "What? Why are you upset?" And they said, "Well, because people are going to think it's too radical." I said, No. I said, "Listen," I said, "if somebody is sitting watching the news and they see that you're demonstrating against the hunt,
Mhm.
and they think that this is just about the hunt," I said, "if they think about it for more than 30 seconds, they're going to say, well, gee, what's the difference between, we go to the store and we buy meat, and those animals, they have a worse life than the animals in the woods. The animals in the woods at least are free for a while, and someone comes with a gun or a bow and arrow and kills them or tries to kill them or whatever. And and it may be a rotten way to die, and they may die slowly and whatever. But nevertheless, do they really suffer more than the animals that we eat? That it's perfectly no one's challenging us on eating those animals. Mm-hmm. And so, it's like all single issue campaigns. Once you start portraying something, I don't care whether it's hunting or fur or whatever. Once you start portraying certain forms of exploitation as morally more problematic than other forms of exploitation, then you invite people to say, well, if I'm not going to give it all up, why should I give this piece of it up? That's why you need to challenge them to say, no, if you take this seriously, you need to give it all up. And you really do recognize that. You already accept what I'm about to tell you. You just haven't seen the implications of what you already believe. So I think it's fundamentally problematic to say to people, go vegetarian first. Don't to take that first step of being a vegetarian. I think it's problematic because first of all, it's dishonest. It makes people think that there's any sort of distinction. I don't care whether it's an empirical or a moral one, but that there's any sort of meaningful distinction between eating flesh and eating other animal products. There is not. Mm-hmm. Absolutely not. And what you're doing is actually encouraging people to believe that there's such a distinction. There isn't. And what happens with a lot of people when they go vegetarian, they don't go vegan, they end up eating more dairy products, which actually may increase net suffering. Not that I think that whether it does or not, I think it's wrong. But I think as an empirical matter, it may end up increasing net suffering and death. So my view is that you ought to be frank with people right from the beginning and tell them, look, tell them the truth. The truth is always a good thing to tell people. And tell people the truth that there is no distinction between flesh and other animal products.
Yeah. Now, also, you push a lot of being honest with the theoretical side of it, instead of just, for instance, if you open up some of these Go Vegan or even just the Go Vegetarian pamphlets, they phrase things a lot like minimizing suffering or addressing cruelty, or that veganism is just a tool or a method of boycott against suffering. But part of your argument, or your argument in general, is more about the theoretical side of it.
No, actually, it's a different theory. Mm-hmm. I'm glad you raised it. I'm glad you.
But the theoretical side of animal use instead of suffering. Right?
Well, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm glad you phrased it that way because mm-hmm. I think that is. I think the way you phrase the question, I think is good because it'll resonate with a lot of people. There are two different ways of looking at the animal issue, at least two different ways of looking at the animal issue. There's the question about whether or not animals have an interest in continuing to live, or whether they only have an interest in continuing to suffer. Now, or not suffering, rather.
Right.
If you go back 200 years to the foundation of the animal welfare movement in the early 19th century in Britain, you have people like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill who believed that animals did not have an interest in continuing to live because they didn't have the same sort of minds that we have. They didn't think to the future. They didn't think about themselves as individuals. They only cared about not suffering.
Right.
So the foundation of the animal welfare movement, which persists to this day in the writings of Peter Singer, the welfarist notion is that animals don't have an interest in continuing to live. They just have an interest in not suffering. So it doesn't matter that we use them. It only matters how we use them. And so we need to use them in gentle or humane or whatever ways. And so when you say that if you look at some of this literature, it focuses on the suffering of animals, or it sees veganism as a tool to reducing suffering, that's because those people accept the welfarist notion because they buy into Peter Singer's view, they buy into Jeremy Bentham's view, they buy into the general welfarist view that animals don't have an interest in continuing to live, they only have an interest in not suffering. If I believed that, then I would agree with them. I mean, if I thought that animals don't care about whether, if I thought that animals did not have an interest in continuing to live, then I would agree with them that the only issue is reducing suffering, and the only issue is eliminating suffering. And I would still say veganism is the best way to reduce and eliminate suffering. But I would look at it differently from the way that I look at it. I think the position that is taken by vegan outreach or by a lot of these welfare people, including some of the larger organizations, and the position that's taken by Peter is fundamentally speciesist, because they're saying that, look, because animals don't think the same way we do, they don't have an interest in continuing to live, so killing them is not per se a harm. I think that's just nonsense. I mean, I as a matter of fact, I find it really difficult to understand why they think that. And it seems to me, and I've discussed this with Singer, I've discussed this with other people who promote this view, and Singer and I actually had an interesting discussion at the Hahnemann School of Medicine in Philadelphia some years ago, where this issue came up. And Peter's view is basically, as I understand it, that because they're not self-aware, animals are not self-aware in the same way that we're self-aware, they don't have an interest in continuing to live because they don't have a concept of their lives. They don't have a concept of what it is to have a life that's the same sort of concept as you and I have. Now, I agree that animals think, or probably think, very differently from the way that humans think, because our conceptual structures are so linked to symbolic communication, i.e. language. Our concepts are all linked to language. And although animals communicate, they don't, as far as we know, use symbolic communication. They don't use words. And so their consciousness is probably very different from ours, because their consciousness is not linked to a set of concepts that are also, that are themselves linked to this thing called language or symbolic communication. So yes, I would agree that the animals are probably that they think differently from us. But so what? I mean, the idea that because the idea that animals don't have a concept of self-awareness, or they're not aware of themselves, is ridiculous. I think any sentient being, any being who's that is perceptually aware, any being who's perceptually aware has a sense of self, in that being knows when she is suffering, and that she is suffering, and it's not a third party who's suffering. And as far as I'm concerned, that is the only sort of self-awareness that's
so it's just
relevant.
based on sentience. It's not based on like this animal's more like a human, or this animal.
My view? Oh,
absolutely,
absolutely. No, my view is absolutely that sentience is the only thing that matters.
Right.
And interestingly, there's some confusion, because Peter says in Animal Liberation, sentience is all that matters. But Peter also thinks that in order to be a really sort of a full member of the moral community and to have interests that are the same as humans, they've got to have sentience plus. And my view is that no, in order to be a full member of the moral community, in order to have the same sort of interests that humans have, in order to have an interest in one's life, all you need is sentience. And that difference results in our theories going in very, very different directions. But no, I definitely stay away from the notion that animals only have moral significance if they're, quote, like us. I mean, this is where I disagree with Tom Reagan in the case for animal rights. He talks about this notion of subject of a life. You know, he says that in order for an animal to have rights, the animal's got to be a subject of a life. Now, he leaves open the possibility that the theory might be more expansive, but the theory that he's produced is so much focused on this concept of a life notion. That is, animals have to have, they have to be a subject of a life. That is, animals have to have a certain level of perceptual sophistication, cognitive sophistication, before they are considered as being subjects of a life and before they have rights protection on Reagan's view. And I disagree with that. I mean, I think that all of this notion that they have to, all of this thinking that they have to be like us in order to matter,
Mm-hmm.
you know, to get full protection is nonsense. That's speciesist.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it makes no sense to me.
So what do you think an activist should do? Because someone who was very interested in the protection of animals and the rights of animals and just pretty much anything negative they see about animals on TV, whether it be like an NBC broadcast of some of these downer cows or the PETA videos that are on YouTube, and they see this and they say, I need to do something. I want to respond to this. I need to do something. Because often what they're met with is things like, most commonly, it's petitions, I think, and also donations. I guess petitions and donations are kind of like the top two.
Yeah.
What can they do?
Look, I think we've got to recognize that this is not just one movement; it's multiple movements, and you know, there is a tendency on the part of a lot of animal people or whatever to see these videos and a lot of them are really horrifying and whatnot, and their reaction is to say, well, I've got to do something to make this better. I've got to do something to regulate
Sure.
this better. I understand that impulse, and I just disagree with it because I think as a practical matter, welfare reform is useless. It's worse than useless, actually. Welfare reform is problematic because given the status of animals as property, chattel property, animals are nothing but economic commodities. That fact will always result structurally in limiting the level of protection that we're going to give animals because they are property. The more protection we give them, the more expensive, you know, it is.
Right.
And so that means the price that one has to get in selling that animal goes up. And you know, you don't need to know much about economics to know that as price goes up, demand goes down.
Sure. And I think this is a very shocking point to some people when you tell people welfare reform is useless. They're probably saying, "What are you talking about?
Well,
if we just take a chicken out of a cage, isn't that better? Isn't it better treatment for the chickens?" So,
well, welfare reform is useless in that the only things that we're going to see, the only welfare reform we're going to see is that which is economically beneficial or neutral to industry, basically. And that stuff's going to happen anyway, in large part. So if you make radical demands, if you demand veganism, or if you demand complete abolition of animal exploitation, what you're going to get anyway is the welfare reform, because the industry will respond by saying, "Well, we'll make it better." You see?
Right.
So if you take the more radical position of advocating abolition of animal exploitation, what you're going to end up getting in the end is welfare reform anyway. So I don't know why people are wasting their time advocating welfare reform, because most of the things that they're advocating for are things which are going to happen as an economic matter anyway. Let me give you a case in point. The Kentucky Fried Chicken, you know, the PETA campaign to get KFC to gas chickens rather than use the electrical stunning.
This was
method.
KFC Canada?
Yeah, well, it's going on now with respect to KFC in the United States. You know, so I mean, it's a continuing campaign, and now it is absolutely clear. The economic studies are absolutely clear that it's much better, it's much more cost effective to use the controlled atmosphere killing or stunning methods than it is to use electrical stunning. And if you were starting a chicken slaughtering operation tomorrow, you would have to be a complete lunatic to install an electrical stunning system, because the carcass damage, the worker injuries, the general maintenance and operation of that system costs more than the controlled atmosphere killing or controlled atmosphere stunning.
So besides welfare, anything, it's just as a matter of an industry standard,
Sure,
it's actually better.
Sure. Absolutely. And that's why I believe Kentucky Fried Chicken Canada has... Look, in another few years, most chicken slaughter operations are going to be controlled atmosphere killing, controlled atmosphere stunning, because it is economically the better thing to do. Ironically, I think what may be happening is I think Kentucky Fried Chicken in the United States may actually be resisting this, because you know there's a thing that goes on, sociologists talk about, in terms of what happens when you have an industry that is challenged by the animal welfare community, whatever community, whatever interest group it is, industry will resist that regulation, even if it's not economically detrimental, because if they don't impose an opportunity cost on the people who are trying to regulate them, then the message may get out that they're easy pickings, and then somebody may make demands that they don't like. You see? So the Kentucky Fried Chicken situation is just one example of that's a welfare reform that's going to happen anyway, because it's economically in the interest of producers. Same thing with gestation crates. I mean, gestation crates are an economic disaster for pork producers, because it's much better to use electronic sow feeding. That results in much higher pork productivity, much higher pork productivity. Same thing with veal crates. I mean, if you look at the agricultural economics journals, and I suspect from Nebraska, people probably read a lot of that stuff, right? I mean, you have it on your dining room table, the Journal of Agricultural Economics, and so if you read the journal, if you read these journals about that focus on agricultural economics, you'll see that the veal crate is a very inefficient way of producing veal, because the veterinary cost, the animal's under constant stress. So the veterinary costs of producing veal under those circumstances is pretty expensive. You're much better off giving the animals slightly more space. You're not giving them a lot more space, you're just giving them slightly more space, and you're giving them some social contact. And that doesn't generally adversely affect the quality of the meat in terms of the way it aesthetically appears to elite people who think that they have to have a veal and be a certain color veal. But it actually reduces the veterinary cost considerably, because the calves are under less stress. You see, so you can get them to market cheaper, basically. So things like the veal crate, things like the gestation crate, things like the controlled atmosphere killing, controlled atmosphere stunning. Those things are things which are by and large economically, they're certainly not economically harmful to industry. And when industry takes these steps, it allows industry to sort of say to the public, we care about animal welfare, we're good people. And then you have these weird campaigns where the animal welfare people pressure these people to do things which are economically in their interest, or at least economically neutral. Then when they agree to do it, the animal people claim victory, and they fundraise off of it, and they then praise the industry. And then industry says, well, we really care about animal welfare, and they have the kumbaya moment with PETA. And what this does is encourages people to actually think that the consumption of animal products is fine. You see, this sends a very, very, very bad message to the public. It encourages them to continue to consume animal products. So animal welfare is problematic, not only because it doesn't provide significant levels of protection, not only because the welfare reform that you get and that we've had for the past 200 years is basically reform that is economically advantageous to, or at the very worst, sort of neutral in terms of industry, but it encourages people to continue the consumption of animal products. That's crazy. So that was probably a longer answer than you wanted, but given that your question was...
Well, I mean, about activism.
Yes.
If welfarism doesn't work,
yeah.
if welfarism doesn't work, does that mean we should be supporting things like fur-free Fridays or meatless Mondays, things that abolish those single things?
No. The problem with...
Devil's advocate.
The problem with Fur-Free Friday is that it encourages people to believe that there's a difference between fur and other animal products, whether it's leather or wool or silk or whatever, and that's problematic. And I have issues. I've written about this. I have particular issues with the anti-fur campaign, because I think it's sexist and misogynistic, and I think it sort of gives people yet another excuse for walking up to strange women on the street and sort of giving them a hard time, and I don't think we should be doing that. And it's interesting that that
and yet we wouldn't do that to somebody wearing leather.
No, exactly, because you worry about getting hit. You worry about a violent response, whereas most people are not worried when they go up to a woman on the street, and as I have seen many times in my life, seen animal people go up to people on the street and call a woman a very foul name because she's wearing a fur coat. I mean, I used to see that this used to happen at anti-fur demonstrations all the time, and it used to make me very unhappy and upset. And I used to express my lack of happiness and my state of being upset about it, and oftentimes it fell on deaf ears. But no, I think Fur-Free Friday is a waste of time, because I think we ought to be encouraging people not to wear any animal products. I think Meat-Free Monday, first of all, it's not even meat and dairy free and other, it's not even Vegan Monday. It's like the first problem with it is distinguishes between flesh and other animal products. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that I'm all in favor of saying to you, if you say, look, I'm not going to go vegan immediately. I will try to persuade you to go vegan immediately. If you say to me, look, I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to do it. Just forget about it. I'm not going to do it. You can talk to me until you're blue in the face. I'm not going to do it. Can you give me an interim step? I'll say, sure, fine. Go vegan in 3 steps. Go vegan for breakfast for a couple weeks, and when you see your arms and legs don't fall off, you don't go blind or anything like that. Then go vegan for lunch for a couple weeks. Then go vegan for dinner.
Whereas other people would say, why don't you go vegetarian and give up meat?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't do it, nor would I encourage you to eat cage-free eggs or whatever. And I want to come back to cage-free eggs for a second.
Sure.
Actually, sort of a footnote to what I was saying before, and that is, cage-free eggs actually do cost slightly more than the conventional battery cage, but only about a penny an egg. And so, and the thing is, people will pay slightly more for eggs that are produced, in organic eggs or cage-free eggs, because they think they're healthier. I mean, there's this issue that they're healthier.
But not just off the shelf. I mean, if you pass a store and they say we serve cage-free eggs in our potato salads or something like that, that's actually an attractive quality.
Yeah, but the bottom line is that the elasticity of eggs, in other words, price elasticity is a concept that economists use when they're talking about, if you raise the price, how much does it affect the demand? If the demand for a product is inelastic, then if you raise the price, the demand doesn't change. If you raise the price on an elastic product, then people will shift to a different product, or they'll go to a different brand or whatever. So the elasticity, eggs are a fairly inelastic item in that you can raise the price and people will still continue to demand that level of egg. The demand is not going to fluctuate significantly. Actually, it's what's happening is you're getting producers that are switching to cage-free, or that are having cage-free operations alongside the conventional battery cage. They're charging a good deal more. It only costs them a penny more an egg to produce a cage-free egg, but yet they're charging more than 12 cents more a dozen. Because they're using this as
penny is an investment.
Exactly. They're making money. They're turning around. They're spending 12 cents more a dozen to get the cage-free eggs, and they're turning around and charging $1, $1.50 more, and people are paying it. So you know what? What that is telling them, that there's a certain market failure here, that in fact the animal people have once again come to the rescue and helped industry become more effective and more profitable by encouraging them to go cage-free, because they can make a lot of money from doing this, and it's not going to affect demand. And so I think people really have to sort of take a step back and sort of see what's really going on here. And what's happening is there is a relationship developing between it's developing more, but it's been in existence for a while, between the animal movement and industry. This sort of crazy relationship between the institutional exploiters and the, quote, animal people. The animal people have become allies of the institutional animal producers. They have become actual allies. They're helping them to become more economically productive and efficient by identifying practices that are economically inefficient. Because think about it. Intensive agriculture is something that developed in the 1940s and 1950s. It is only now, in the first part of the 21st century, that economists are beginning to understand the economic inefficiencies of certain practices. You see? And so what's happening is the animal people are identifying those practices. They're reading the same journals that industry reads. They're reading their industry journals. They're reading the papers that say that veal crates are economically inefficient, gestation crates are economically inefficient, electric stunning of chickens is economically inefficient. And they're identifying those things as the low-hanging fruit. That's actually an expression that some of them use, exactly. The low-hanging fruit. Right. They're identifying these things as the low-hanging fruit. They're going to industry saying, change these things. We demand that you change these things. Industry says, they put up the token resistance. Then eventually they capitulate and they say, okay, fine, we'll change. And then everybody's a winner. The animal people claim victory. The industry claims we're humane. The animal movement makes a lot of money off of this stuff, off of these campaigns. The exploiters then, make everybody feel comfortable about eating animals. So industry wins because people feel more comfortable about exploiting animals. The animal movement wins because it gets to do fundraising off of these campaigns. The only entity that loses, the only group that loses, the animals. So going back to the fur-free and the meatless Mondays. What if somebody were to say, oh, yeah, I agree that there is no moral distinction between using the animal for fur or using it for leather or using it for meat or dairy.
But what we're simply doing is we're doing the fur-free thing, and then we're going to go on to do a leather-free thing.
But see, the problem is that the confusion that comes from that.
Mm-hmm.
You have to, if you're going to do something like that. This is something I discussed at great length, maybe greater length than I should have, in Rain Without Thunder, which is a book I wrote in 1996. Because I said, if you're going to have a single issue campaign, you got to make it real clear that the single issue campaign is really part of an overall strategy to eliminate animal exploitation altogether. The problem is when you're trying to portray fur as being worse than leather, or whatever, when you're trying to isolate something as worse than something else, the people who are intelligent enough, and that's basically a lot of people. Because the movement underestimates the intelligence of the average. You talk about elitism. The movement underestimates the intelligence of the average person and assumes that people are not able to understand this, and that is elitism.
Sure, and they say people get scared away.
That is elitism. That's nonsense. Yeah. People will understand that there's really no difference between fur and leather, and so therefore, to the extent that you're not challenging them about leather, and they're not going to give up leather, they say, why should I give up fur? I mean, I've had these discussions with people. I mean, I remember in the early 90s, because I didn't go up to people and call them names or throw paint on them or whatever, and I would go up and I would have discussions like I would be sitting next to somebody on an airplane who had a fur coat, and I would have, I'd start a discussion with that person about fur, and I would learn about how that person thinks, you see. And so
and did this person get defensive in any way, or was this just
no.
like a nice...
No. You know what? As long as you don't threaten people, you can talk to people about just about anything. And one of the things that I've developed over the past quarter century that I've been a professor in university is you have to talk to people, a lot of different people, and particularly in an institution like this, Rutgers University, which is a very diverse institution, and we're very proud of that, and I love teaching here because of the diversity. But the diversity makes you sensitive to how you explain and how you engage people in discussions, because you're oftentimes talking to people who do not have the same values that you have, or don't have the same life experiences that you have. You're not coming from the homogenized elite Ivy League university context where I taught for the first 5 years of my life. I taught at the University of Pennsylvania, where the student body was much more homogenized, and so it was everybody was pretty much alike. Now I'm at a university where there's a great deal of diversity, and it requires that you actually learn how to communicate with people in a different way from the way that you communicate with them in a homogenized environment where everybody shares the same values and everyone's had the same, pretty much the same life experiences, and where everybody pretty much looks the same. Well, what I've learned over the years is, yes, I mean, I can be sitting next to somebody on an airplane and just start a completely, she's got a fur coat, and I'll just start a discussion. I don't immediately say, you're wearing that fur coat, and gee, I really have an objection to that. As a matter of fact, well, I mean, I oftentimes.
How do you start something like that, by the way?
Well, I'll tell you the last great conversation I had. Well, actually, not the last great one, but one that will always stick in my mind. Happened a couple of years ago. I was on my way. I guess I was going to Paris, and I was sitting next to this woman who had a fur coat, and it was a fox coat, and she didn't have it on. She had it at the back of the seat, and so it was. And I was reading Introduction to Animal Rights because I was thinking of doing another edition of the book. Mm-hmm. So I had the book, and I was looking at it, and I was thinking, how would I change this if I did a second edition? How would I change it? And so she asked me. She said, is that an interesting book? So it's an intriguing book. And then we chatted a little bit, and then my meal came, because the meal came fairly quickly after that. Sure. And they brought me this vegan meal, and she asked me about the meal, why I had a special meal. I said, well, I'm a vegan, and it's related to this animal rights stuff. And we got into this discussion. We ended up talking all the way to Paris. I mean, we talked all night long. And we had this really interesting discussion, and I told her eventually that I had written the book. I gave her the book. And she wrote to me afterward and told me that she was thinking of becoming a vegan, and that she was no longer wearing the fur, and that she had given the fur coat away to some group in, I guess, Paris, where she lived, and so that they could use it in demonstrations or whatever. But no, but I've had plenty of conversations over the years with women wearing fur coats, and I've made a lot more progress with them, I can assure you, than people going up to them on the streets, calling them names, throwing things at them, or in any way being menacing or threatening to them. Because there is no difference between a woman who wears a fur coat and a man or a woman who wears wool. And since most people in the animal rights movement are still wearing wool, and many of them wear leather, I don't see the woman wearing the fur coat as morally indistinguishable from the people who are wearing wool. I mean, it's all bad in my judgment.
Sure.
And so, but what happens is when you say to somebody, you shouldn't wear fur, that person is smart enough to understand, well, other people are wearing other animal products like wool, and so, like, what's the difference between the fact, I mean, no one's challenging me about wool, so if it's all right for me to wear wool, why isn't it all right for me to wear fur? And so that's why, if you're going to have an anti-fur campaign, you've got to make sure that it's clear that this is part of a general campaign against all animal exploitation, against all the use of all animal clothing, and the use of all animals, use of animals for food, for experimentation, for entertainment, for whatever. And that's why my view is, at this point in time, at this time in history, the only thing that makes sense is to focus on creative, nonviolent vegan education, and sort of explain the whole thing as one unified whole. That's what I do. That's what I have been doing for years now. I find it works. I think that people...
It sounds like it's easier than people think, really.
It's very
people
easy.
think that it scares people away.
It doesn't scare people away. I mean, I do talks to groups of people who are not animal. You know what scares away? The irony is, it is easier for me to talk to a group of omnis who are not in the animal movement than it is for me to go talk to a bunch of animal people. It's much more difficult.
I'll testify that myself.
Much more difficult.
Definitely.
You talk to animal people, and you got to get all this stuff about. It's multiple layers of problems in terms of, you can't get them away from this notion that there's a distinction between meat and dairy.
Mm-hmm.
Reason why? Because a lot of them ain't vegans. Point number one, or they live. That's the other thing is, even if they're vegans, they live with somebody, or they're married to somebody who's not a vegan, so they have that intense resistance to, sort of recognizing that this is something, that A, it's a moral issue, and B, that there's no distinction between dairy and flesh. Mm-hmm. So you have all of that sort of resistance because of relational dynamics. But I can go into a group of people, go into talk, and I do all the time, I do it frequently, in which these are not animal people. These are just people who are sort of interested in, they're interested in thinking about the issue, but they're not involved with any of the groups, or they think that the groups are problematic, or I talk to a lot of groups of university people who think that Pete is silly, and who don't, and they think the movement's silly, and they don't really understand. They know there's some serious issues there, but they're not sure how to get to them. And I will discuss with those people, and they see it makes perfect sense to say that they may not agree, they may not say I'm going to go vegan tomorrow, but I get them thinking. Yeah. And I present the issues, and see, my view is that. I have an obligation to always make it clear that veganism is the only position which is consistent with accepting that animals are morally significant, accepting that they have at least the right not to be treated as property, and accepting that they're members of the moral community. Whatever else you do with them, you can't eat them, you can't use them for entertainment purposes, you can't wear them. The only use of our animals, the only use that we make of animals that isn't transparently frivolous, and I really mean transparently frivolous, is the use of animals to cure serious human illnesses. And I don't think that that's morally justifiable, but that requires a more complex, slightly more complex discussion. But the rest of the stuff, if you accept that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals, which everybody, I've never met anybody, Adam. I've never met anybody. I haven't been in Nebraska yet, but I've never met anybody who would say that it's okay to inflict suffering and death on animals that is not necessary. Then, once I get them to accept that, I simply say, okay, fine. Well, we could have an interesting philosophical discussion about what necessity means, but I'll save you the boredom. Would you agree with me that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience? Absolutely. And then I'll get people talking to me about Michael Vick. Yeah, I'm really upset about what Michael Vick did. And I say, fine, let him talk a little bit about Michael Vick. And then I say, okay, fine, you eat animals? Yeah. Then you tell me how you're different from Michael Vick. You tell me the best justification you have for eating those animals or eating those animal products is that they taste good. Mm-hmm. So what you're basically saying is that although on one hand you say it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals, on the other hand, you think that it's the pleasure that you get, or the amusement that you get, or the convenience that you have from going in and getting a McDonald's burger or whatever it is that you eat, that justifies suffering and death. Then it's either the case that you can't think clearly, or you don't really agree with the proposition that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals. And I find, I just articulated to you the bones of the argument. You know what? It ain't that difficult, is it? As a matter of fact, you don't need much philosophical. Indeed, I would say you don't need any philosophical sophistication to understand or make that argument. And it's extremely powerful. You cannot believe when it's articulated in this way. People oftentimes look at you as though you've just sort of, you've just come out with E equals M, energy equals.
Sure.
That it's like they've never thought about it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets people thinking. It's not difficult to do. It's not, what I think is problematic is, you go up to people, you start showing them gory pictures. Mm-hmm. And they say, oh, this is really horrible. But then you've got all these animal organizations that are saying, yeah, we agree it's horrible, so help us make it less horrible. So you think the solution is to make it less horrible. Right. And the bottom line is, we will never, ever, ever have animal agriculture that is humane. I would argue it can never be humane, but as a theoretical matter, but as a practical matter, you can't kill that many animals and raise and kill that many animals necessary to provide food for billions and billions of people in any way other than those horrible ways. You see, you can tidy it up a little bit here and there. You can maybe stop people from whacking pigs over the head with clubs when they don't even need to, right. Just expressing sadistic urges or whatever pathologies develop in those pathological circumstances. But you can maybe deal with that, but you're never going to really make those situations significantly better. And what bothers me is you got animal groups that are going to people saying, here are the gory pictures. People say, oh, this is really terrible. Oh, okay, write your check and we'll fix it for you. See, that's what bothers me, because that's what's going on, and that stuff just doesn't work. And so what we all need, and we need to get away from this idea that you need these multi-million-dollar organizations in order to have activism. Indeed, quite the contrary. Once you've got multi-million-dollar charities like that, you aren't going to have activism, you're going to have charities. That's what those organizations are. They're charities. Mm-hmm. They are not going to change the world because they don't want to change the world. They're charities, they're businesses, they're 501c3 organizations that exist because people look at gory pictures and say, I want to do something. What do I do? Oh, write your check. That's what those organizations exist to do. We need to get away from this idea that we need leaders. We need to get away from this altogether. This whole concept of leaders and it's crazy. Mm-hmm. Each of us needs to be a leader. Each of us needs to educate herself on the basics of the arguments. We need to inform ourselves about the facts. We need to understand the basic arguments. And then we need to go teach. That's what we need to do.
And after that, I think that we need to get back to just good old-fashioned dialogue instead of throwing the red paint.
Exactly.
And, putting up the gory pictures and that sort of thing.
Exactly.
And you've explained the theoretical problems to that already. But just having like that conversation you had on the plane with that lady who had the fox coat, just getting people talking. Man, I had asked you earlier, how did you get that discussion going? Because that's always the hardest part for me, is just to get it going. Without, well...
It's easy.
But really, when you get into that dialogue, you're in a good spot with that person. You just got to talk to them, and if you know what you're talking about.
That's right, and it flows very easily. If we're comfortable with it, flows very easily. And the thing is it's always important to understand something, and that is, this is not about us. Because I think animal people are very good at sort of suffer. I mean, as a matter of fact, animal people suffer better than any single group. They can hang on a cross better than any group I've ever met in my life. And that's really got to stop. I mean, that's counterproductive. This is not about us and our suffering. It's about the slaughter of billions and billions of animals every year, and the enormous violence that entails, and the implications that has for human rights issues as well as animal rights issues, because animal agriculture and animal exploitation as a general matter is not distinguishable from human exploitation. This is all part of the same mess. And we need to see that. We need to understand the connections. And that's something I want to talk about if we have time. And we need to see this is not about us, it's about them. And what we need to do is we need to educate ourselves, and we need to not make judgments about people. Make judgments about actions. Don't make judgments about people. There's this tendency to sort of think, that the welfarists do this. They divide the world into us and them, and they say, don't argue with us. Let's make the fight is with them, the exploiters. That's crazy. because the institutional exploiters are nothing but capitalists who have their money invested in a particular activity. Once that becomes not profitable, they'll simply move their money.
Yeah, I think we tend to think of them as just these evil people who just wake up in the morning and they're like, I want to kill some cows today or something.
Right. I mean, there's a tendency to always portray the other as a bad person. And so, we did this when I was growing up, given that I'm significantly older than you, when I was growing up and before the Soviet Union fell, and, we had this idea that communists were people who sort of sat there and said, oh, Nikita Khrushchev, was sitting there saying, oh, it's really hard, it's really great being a horrible person, I enjoy being evil. When in fact, he I'm sure thought quite sincerely that capitalism was a bad system, just like some of us thought that communism was a bad system. And I think similar. There's this similar sort of cartoonish characterization of animal exploiters as these evil people, and they're the enemy. And my view is that's sort of comical because you have a group of animal people, many of whom are not even vegans. They're the people who are creating the demand in the first place for these products, and they're saying, "Oh, don't argue with us. Let's all look at them as the enemy." And the answer is, "No, sorry, Charlie, you're the problem. You're the one who's creating the demand." So I actually don't have a whole lot in common with you in terms of our, if you're not a vegan and you say, look, you and I have got a lot in common. It's the exploiter that we ought to be challenging. And the answer is no, you and I have a problem because you're the one who's creating a demand that the exploiter is responding to. The exploiter is indifferent. The exploiter is a capitalist who is indifferent to how she puts where her money is for where her money is. So she'll just move it to a different use. Once one use becomes unprofitable, she'll just move it to another use. So my view is the economic reality is people who aren't vegans are creating the demand. So the idea that the welfarists say, don't argue with us non-vegans. Let's all argue with the exploiters. The answer is, you're the exploiter.
And there are actually groups who will use violent tactics to attack these people and say, stop supplying what people want.
Exactly. You have the animal welfare people who divide the world into the exploiters and everybody else.
Right.
And, the animal people, the good people and the exploiters. And then you have the people who promote violence, who say, let's use violence against the exploiters. Well, then, do you have any non-vegans in your family? Then put on your balaclava and go and throw bricks at them or whatever. It just makes no sense to me whatsoever. And it doesn't matter. You can burn down 10 slaughterhouses. It just doesn't matter because if the demand is there, then that supply is going to be met by 10 other suppliers. If Huntington Life Sciences, you can close them down. And you know what? Another supplier, if the demand is there for the use of animals, if the demand is there for the use of animals in experiments, then that supply is just going to shift to somebody else. And what I find really comical is a lot of these people who are promoting violence are not vegans. So, and they live with people who aren't vegans, or they interact with people. If violence is justified, then...
Now, you're not saying that it's wrong to live with people who are not vegans.
Oh, no. What I'm saying is, it's comical to me. Talk about a lack of clear thinking. Talk about confusion that is profound. The idea that it is all right if you are somebody you're not a vegan, as some of these people who publicly promote violence are not vegans. Well, what sense does it make to say it's all right to use violence against an exploiter? I'm an exploiter, by the way, but it's okay for me to use violence against an institutional exploiter who's actually in many ways less culpable than you are because you're the one that's creating the demand that the supplier whose window you're throwing a brick through is responding to. It makes no sense to me. Absolutely none. It never has. And I understand it appeals to sort of the juvenility of the movement. There's this notion of it's cool to be violent, or it's but apart from, again, it focuses on activists and not the issue. This is about us. This is about us feeling good about putting on our balaclavas and going on doing direct action, or this is about us as animal people hanging on a cross and suffering for the animal. Stop that. Just stop that. It's counterproductive. And it's not really addressing the problem, which is the suffering and death of billions and billions of animals. That is only going to change when we shift the paradigm It's not going to result from violence because, look, if violence was a solution to anything, we'd be living in utopia right now because the history of humankind is the history of violence. I mean, violence hasn't gotten us really anywhere. And violence is not a solution to the problem. It is the problem. And so as long as we pursue violence, we're only going to have violence. Violence will beget violence. So we really need to shift the paradigm. Right now, you and I live in a world in which eating animals, wearing animals, using animals is as natural as breathing or drinking water. It's not, a lot of animal activists try to say, well, but this is like slavery. Now, I agree, economic, as a matter of fact, a good part of one of my books is about the economic similarities between animal exploitation and slavery. So I'm quite familiar with all of those arguments. However, I would suggest to you that the situation we're dealing with now with animals is a historical matter, sociological matter, very, very different from slavery, from human slavery. I mean, if you want to talk about race-based slavery in the United States, because there was always a lot of opposition to race-based slavery in the United States. There was always a lot of opposition. There were always a lot of people who said, this is not a good thing, you see. Whereas with animal exploitation, most people think it's perfectly normal. It's their default position. Mm-hmm. It's their default position. So what we've got to do is we have the hard job of shifting the paradigm and getting people away from that notion of animals as things, as animals as human resources, as animals as animals as commodities that are here for us to exploit. That's not going to come by burning down slaughterhouses. That's such a silly activity. Closing Huntington Life Sciences. It's not going to come from making animal welfare, tidying up, putting televisions in concentration camps. It's simply not going to, that's not going to change. Mm-hmm. That's not going to change it. What's going to change it is getting people to see that animal use as a general matter is morally unjustifiable. That's what's going to get people. That's how you move people. And I think that what we're doing right now with this welfare reform movement is actually making people feel as though this is a problem that can be solved through regulation. We can make the exploitation of animals more, quote, humane, end quote. And the answer is no, we can't. That still would be wrong even if we did. But as a practical matter, we can't. This is an economic matter. We're never, let us say that in some state, the voters of that state were willing to pay a lot more money for animal products, so they supported some sort of welfare reform that actually increased the price of animals significantly, but resulted in significant welfare benefits, so that you did have, it wasn't perfect, it was still inhumane, it was still torture, but it was a lot better. Even if that happened, it's not going to happen, but even if it did happen, as long as the demand is there for the lower welfare product, you can't stop the lower welfare product from being imported in. You can't. Basically the law, whether it's the domestic law in the United States that would basically prevent that, or whether it's these regional or global trade agreements, these free trade agreements. Simply, if the demand for the lower welfare product is there, then the demand will be met. The supply will come in from places where there are lower welfare products being produced. So you're never really going to change things until you get people. I guess you could say, well, but isn't it then better to try to educate people about being willing to pay a lot more money for animal products so that they can get a lot more humanely produced animal products? And the answer to that is, why waste your time? Once somebody's willing to pay $20 more a pound for steak to get, quote, humanely raised meat, why don't you just try to get that person, if that person cares that much, that much about the issue where she's willing to pay that much more money, then that's a person who's going to become that's a person who is ripe for being educated about veganism. Right. So why waste the time talking to her about demanding the higher welfare product? What bothers me is that these welfare reforms are not resulting in anything that they're not resulting in any significant welfare benefits, but yet you got people like Peter Singer and all these animal welfare organizations running around saying things are a lot better for animals. That is a lie. That is an outright lie. Mm-hmm. Things are not much better for animals. But the bottom line is if you care about animals and you regard them as morally significant, and you think that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals, then you have no choice but to go vegan, because there is no moral justification. We would all agree that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals. We would all agree that inflicting suffering and death on animals for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience is if it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering, but it's okay to do it if we find it pleasurable, amusing, or convenient, then we've created a loophole that is so large that we've got an exception now that's so large that it swallows up the rule. So we would all agree, I assume, that it's wrong to inflict suffering and death on animals for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. Yet 99.9999999% of the use of animals that we make can be justified only by pleasure, amusement, or convenience, with the use of animals for food being the most significant use of animals. By the way, I'm talking to the camera. That's the viewer. I'm trying to convince you out there. We're killing 56 billion animals a year annually worldwide for food. That doesn't include fish or aquatic non-humans, which basically, is probably a number that's almost as big, if not bigger, than 56 billion. So we're talking about over 100 billion sentient beings are being killed every year for food, and the best justification we have is that they taste good. So if we take seriously the notion that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals, we have no choice but to go vegan. It is not necessary for us to eat animals. It's not necessary for us to lead an optimally healthy life. Indeed, even mainstream healthcare people are now identifying a number of diseases and other maladies that we're suffering as a result of eating animal products. And animal agriculture is an ecological disaster. It takes between 6 and 12 pounds of plant protein to produce 1 pound of flesh. It takes 1,000 times more water to produce a pound of flesh than it does to produce a pound of potatoes or wheat. It's an environmental disaster. It's destroying the groundwater, and animal agriculture is a larger source of methane gas, which is one of the greenhouse gases. Larger source than is the consumption of fossil fuels for transportation purposes. So the bottom line is, there's no justification for this other than the fact that it tastes good. And it's an ecological disaster. It's bad for our health. So why are we doing it? If you care about animals, if you regard them as morally significant, then you've got really no choice except to go vegan. And it's easy. I've been a vegan for, I guess, going on 27 years now. And I've been a vegan probably longer than you've been alive. There you go.
You were talking about the Civil War earlier.
There you go. Exactly. I've been a vegan for 27 years, and I have to say that when I became a vegan 27 years ago, it was significantly more difficult. Certainly to find processed foods, which I don't eat much anymore anyway, but certainly to find processed foods, it was more difficult. But now there's nothing you can't get. You can get these soy ice creams that are delicious if that's what you like to eat. There's all sorts of stuff that you can eat. So it's easy. It's better for your health. It's better for the planet. But most importantly, it's the morally right thing to do. So the next time you look at your dog or your cat or whatever non-human that you live with, and you recognize you recognize how much you love that creature and how much she or he loves you back, and you realize that that's not a thing, that's a non-human person. Realize that every time you stick a fork into a piece of flesh or drink a glass of milk, you're responsible for the suffering and death of a being that is no less, there's no different, not in any way different from the dog or the cat that you love and is a member of your family. And as far as the distinction between flesh and dairy is concerned, I think there's more suffering in a glass of milk than there is in a pound of steak. Dairy animals are kept alive longer, they're treated worse, they all end up in the same slaughterhouse. That's what I would say to your viewer. And there's a final thing that I would like to say, and that is about the relationship between human rights and animal rights. Many animal people do not seem to think that there's a relationship between human rights issues and animal rights issues. Well, that's wrong. Speciesism is bad because it's like racism, sexism, and heterosexism and other forms of discrimination, because it uses an irrelevant criterion, species, as a characteristic, uses an irrelevant characteristic as a criterion for membership in the moral community. And so therefore we do have a position on racism, sexism, and heterosexism. Now I realize that the large animal organizations, because they're organizations that don't want to offend anybody, because they don't want to do anything which decreases that donor base, Adam. So therefore they don't want to take a position on racism or sexism or heterosexism because they don't want to offend people. But I understand that, but that doesn't make it right. We have to see that there is a relationship between speciesism and these other forms of discrimination, which is one of the reasons why, by the way, I really object to using sexism to try to promote the issue of animal rights. I think that's fundamentally wrong. I think sexism is inherently wrong, but I also think that as long as we continue to commodify women, we're going to continue to commodify non-humans. Sexism and speciesism are very, 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 very similar. And I think that I really, really object to these sexist campaigns that are supposedly going to increase awareness about animal rights. And I have to say that I used to be involved with PETA through the 1980s and the early 1990s, and had many arguments with people at PETA about the I'd rather go naked than wear fur campaign when it came up in the late 1980s. And the proof's in the vegan pudding. And that is the fur industry is larger and more powerful than it's ever been. And the I'd rather go naked than wear fur campaign hasn't, in my judgment, done anything. It wouldn't, I mean, even if it did, it wouldn't be morally justified. But it hasn't done anything. As a practical matter, let's put the theory aside. As a practical matter, it has done nothing to weaken the fur industry. And if anything, it's given people yet another excuse, along with many others that we provide the world, to dismiss the movement. Because think about it. I mean, would Martin Luther King say, I'd rather go naked than sit in the back of the bus? And the answer is no, of course he wouldn't. And I think that, for us to be using sexism to promote the message of animal rights is to trivialize the message and to give progressive people yet another reason to dismiss it.
Well, thank you for sitting down with us and this awesome interview. So that's all the show we have for today. Also check out Gary's billion books that he has out. He's got a podcast. He's got a blog. He's even got a freaking Twitter account. So
yes,
all that's going to be in the show's notes.
You can go to my, you're going to give them my website and stuff like that?
Abolitionistapproach.com, and
okay.
I'll have the link to all the books, the whole...
Beautiful. That's beautiful.
The whole thing.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed having you
Check it out at vegan.fm/news. Thanks. We'll see you later.
The bottom line is if you care about animals and you regard them as morally significant, and you think that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals, then you have no choice but to go vegan, because there is no moral justification